Some shifts shake the entire global chessboard, yet unfold in complete silence. No gunfire, no immediate crisis, just quiet flows of aluminum changing direction, and with them a silent migration of power away from what was once taken for granted. When tariffs become a weapon, what's truly being hurt? The adversary, or the very industrial backbone of America itself. In just a moment, we'll unpack the story behind this quiet shift, and if you're interested in deep, data-driven geopolitical analysis with long-term implications, not slogans, subscribe now so you don't miss the key fault lines that are reshaping the global order. For decades, Canadian aluminum flowed into the US economy in a way few ever noticed. No fanfare, no slogans, no debate. It wasn't featured in campaign speeches, it wasn't brought up in tense press conferences, and it rarely surfaced in congressional hearings. Aluminum simply existed, quietly crossing the border, entering factories, merging into production lines, becoming car bodies, airplane wings, building frames, power lines. It had been around so long, people forgot it was ever a choice, and not just a given. And it's that sense of being a given that forms the foundation of power. When a resource becomes so familiar, it's no longer seen as a relationship to nurture, but as a natural condition of the system. In the eyes of many policymakers in Washington, Canadian aluminum had slipped into that blind spot. It was assumed to be always available, always there, always flowing south, no matter how the political winds shifted. Then came June. A 50% tariff was imposed, and the flow didn't slam to a halt. It slowed, it hesitated, and most crucially, it started looking for another path. There were no chaotic headlines, no market meltdowns, just closed-door meetings, new spreadsheets, and quiet but existential questions. Can this market still be trusted 10 or 20 years from now? In today's world of modern supply chains, questions like that carry more weight than any political statement. Manufacturers don't abandon markets out of anger, but out of uncertainty. They don't restructure out of defiance, but out of survival. And when policy risk becomes a permanent variable, finding another route is no longer a strategic option. It's a governance duty. The real danger of tariffs isn't in the percentage itself, but in the message it sends. It says that relationships once thought stable can now be reversed with a single political decision. It shatters the long-term assumptions that heavy industries, from automotive to aerospace, rely on just to stay afloat. And when those assumptions collapse, trust collapses too. Slowly, silently. That's why the Canadian aluminum story isn't a shockwave. It's a crack spreading through the structure of what was once the most integrated industrial ecosystem in the world. To understand how a single tariff decision could have such deep and lasting effects, we need to go back to the beginning, how the US-Canada relationship came to integrate aluminum in the first place, and why that foundation was once seen as unshakable. The aluminum relationship between Canada and the US was never built like a typical trade deal. It evolved as a natural extension of the same industrial ecosystem. Geography brought the two economies close. History built trust, and decades of deep integration gradually turned Canadian aluminum into an endogenous element within America's manufacturing structure. It was no longer seen as a foreign import in the traditional sense, but as a vital material flowing within a shared North American industrial body. At the technical level, this integration runs remarkably deep. Metallurgical standards, purity levels, alloy compositions, and quality control processes have been synchronized over years. U.S. production lines in automotive, aerospace, and construction were designed around the specific properties of Canadian aluminum. Changing suppliers isn't just switching vendors, it means reworking an entire chain of design, testing, and certification. That's why Canadian aluminum isn't easily replaceable, even if on paper the market always has other sources. At the economic level, the relationship is unusually long-term. Contracts don't just span quarters, they stretch across years, sometimes decades. Investments in Canadian mines, hydropower, and smelting plants were made under the assumption that the U.S. market would always be there, large, stable, and predictable enough to absorb the output. In return, American corporations built industrial strategies on the belief that Northern aluminum would never become politicized. This mutual trust turned trade into a strategic pillar. When a material becomes so reliable it's invisible, it allows the entire system to optimize costs, improve efficiency, and reduce inventory. It's a kind of silent soft power. No coercion, no threats, but a deeply rooted interdependence. The US didn't just buy aluminum from Canada. It built industrial capacity on the assumption that aluminum would always flow. The problem began when that assumption was no longer shared by both sides. When tariffs were introduced, aluminum was pulled out of its technical role and placed into a political one. It was no longer just a material. It became a bargaining chip. And once a strategic pillar is used as leverage, the entire ecosystem behind it starts to shake. For Canada, this signal was especially sensitive, not because of immediate losses, but because it cast doubt on the future. If a supply chain so deeply integrated can still be hit with steep tariffs via a unilateral decision, where's the limit? The risk is no longer in the current tariff level. It's in the potential for recurrence. And in business, recurring risk is more dangerous than high but rare risk. This is the point where the difference in perspectives becomes clear. Washington sees the aluminum relationship as leverage, a tool to be activated when needed. Ottawa and the aluminum producers see it as a system that must be shielded from political volatility. These two logics don't clash head-on, but they are out of sync. One side believes power lies in the ability to apply pressure. The other believes power lies in maintaining stability. When those two logics collide, what breaks first isn't the physical flow, it's the flow of trust. And once trust begins to fracture, supply chain restructuring becomes almost inevitable. From this very foundation, one once seen as self-evident, Washington stepped into a larger strategic misstep, mistaking dependence for lack of choice, and assuming that because a partner needs you today, they will be willing to tolerate that risk tomorrow. Washington's biggest mistake wasn't in the tariff rate, it was in how they understood power in a world that has fundamentally changed. Under the old logic of trade geopolitics, the largest market always assumed it held the power to dictate terms. The US, as a major aluminum consumer, believed it could set the rules. In that view, Canada was the dependent party, needing the American market to sustain its production, jobs, and growth. But that seemingly reasonable assumption turned out to be a strategic blind spot. In today's global economy, dependence is no longer a one-way street. It's a dynamic structure where each side constantly reassesses cost, risk, and alternative options. Canada is not bound to the US by fate. It has remained connected out of mutual interest and stability. When either of those begins to falter, the shape of the relationship starts to shift. Washington underestimated this. Tariffs were deployed as a test of endurance, under the belief that Canada would have no choice but to comply. But while politicians focused on short-term trade balances, businesses and investors looked much further ahead. They weren't asking, what's the tariff rate this year? But rather, will this risk happen again? And if it does, what are our other options? And that's where the concept of diversification began to take on strategic importance. In Washington, Canada's search for new markets was seen as avoidance, even defiance. But for Canada, it was pure governance logic. When policy risk becomes a permanent variable, risk dispersion is no longer a tactic. It's a duty to shareholders, workers, and the broader economy. The world today has no shortage of aluminum demand. Asia is expanding rapidly. Infrastructure, energy, and industrial production all require large and stable supply. In this landscape, partners willing to sign long-term contracts who prioritize predictability and avoid politicizing trade become far more attractive. Not because they're nicer in values, but because they offer what markets hate most to lose: certainty. Washington confused the appeal of its market with control over its partners' decisions. The US may be a big customer, but it's no longer the only one. And in a world where capital, technology, and logistics can be restructured faster than ever, assuming a partner will tolerate indefinite risk is a dangerous gamble. This shift didn't happen with loud announcements. It unfolded quietly, one new contract at a time, no longer prioritizing the US, one logistics route at a time, redesigned, one investment decision at a time, calculated with a no longer US-centered scenario in mind. By the time Washington began to notice, the shift had already passed the point of easy reversal. The strategic mistake, then, wasn't just losing part of a supply line, it was shaking the trust in American leadership. When a nation uses tariffs as a weapon, it might gain a short-term advantage. But the price is prompting partners to prepare for a world less dependent on you. And it's through those quiet preparations that the consequences begin to boomerang back in the US. Not with sudden crisis, but through slow, deep, and persistent effects, creeping into every industry, every manufacturing community, every purchasing decision. Consequences that only become truly felt once they've built up enough weight, by which point Washington may finally grasp the full cost of its original miscalculation. The consequences within the US didn't arrive with a dramatic bang. There was no day when headlines across the nation screamed aluminum crisis. No sudden market crash that forced the government into urgent intervention. Instead, everything unfolded like a slow erosion, quiet but steady, much like water seeping through stone. And precisely because it wasn't loud, these impacts became harder to recognize and for passion until they had already embedded themselves deep into the structure of the economy. At the surface level, manufacturers began to feel the shift through what seemed like minor changes. Input costs didn't spike overnight, but stabilized at higher levels. Delivery times stretched by a few weeks. Contracts that were once straightforward now required new risk mitigation clauses. Each factor on its own seemed manageable, even explainable. But together, they altered the entire equation of operations. In the automotive industry, where aluminum is increasingly central to reducing weight and meeting environmental standards, the pressure was especially pronounced. Every percentage increase in material cost forced companies to choose between shrinking profit margins or passing costs on to consumers. Neither option was easy. And in a global market growing ever more competitive, even small disadvantages could tip the scale. In aerospace, the risks took a different, less flexible, and more dangerous form. The aluminum used in aircraft isn't something that can be swapped out casually. Each alloy, each shipment must pass years of rigorous certification. When familiar supply becomes less reliable, manufacturers can't simply find a replacement in the short term. The result, project delays, rising costs, and a diminished ability to compete on the global stage, not for lack of technology, but because the supply chain is stretched thin. In construction and infrastructure, the impacts spread differently. Aluminum is foundational for housing, power grids, renewable energy, and urban transit. When material costs rise, projects get delayed. When projects get delayed, local budgets come under pressure. And when budgets tighten, long-term investment decisions get pushed back. People didn't see a crisis, but they did feel rising costs of living that dragged out construction timelines and delayed promises of progress. Deeper still, the effects reached jobs and communities. Regions dependent on industrial manufacturing felt the shift earliest. When companies grew more cautious with investments, when expansion plans were shelved, new jobs didn't appear. It wasn't mass layoffs, it was the absence of opportunity. And over time, that absence eroded the economic vitality of local communities. What's especially notable is how unevenly these effects were distributed. They concentrated on groups with little voice in policymaking. Middle-class consumers paid more for goods. Factory workers faced growing job uncertainty. Local governments carried budgetary strain. Meanwhile, the political upside of tariffs was often expressed through abstract slogans about protecting domestic industry or reasserting strength. This disconnect created a dangerous gap between policy and reality. When costs are dispersed and drawn out over time, they rarely spark urgent political response. But economically, they slowly erode competitiveness and market confidence. And once that confidence weakens, restoring it takes far more than just technical adjustments. At that point, the story is no longer just about production or consumption. It spills over into how businesses view the investment climate, how capital chooses its destination, and how American soft power is perceived in global markets. Once the domestic consequences have accumulated enough weight, corporations, investors, and international partners are forced to ask a fundamental question. Is the US still the most stable place for long-term bets? And it's right there, at that pivot, where the impact of tariffs moves beyond the realm of pure economics and enters a far subtler, deeper battlefield. One where business confidence, investment flows, and soft power begin to erode, little by little. From a business perspective, tariffs are no longer seen as short-term disruptions that can be absorbed through pricing adjustments or contract renegotiations. They are increasingly viewed as part of a new risk structure, one that forces boards of directors to rewrite the foundational assumptions behind every long-term decision. When policy becomes unpredictable, the true cost doesn't lie in the specific tariff rate, but in the prolonged uncertainty surrounding whether it might return, expand, or change abruptly. In this context, the way CEOs and investors assess the U.S. environment has begun to shift, subtly but clearly. In the past, the U.S. was seen as the optimal space to maximize efficiency, a large market, a strong innovation ecosystem, and relatively stable rules of the game. Now, a new variable has entered capital allocation models, and it's growing heavier: policy risk. Not because the US is less attractive, but because it's more unpredictable than it used to be. Capital responds sensitively to such shifts. It doesn't flee in panic, but it slows down, scrutinizes more carefully, and seeks diversification. New projects are now designed with scenarios like if tariffs return, if the supply chain is disrupted, or if this market is no longer the only viable option. These questions are quietly redrawing the global investment map, step by step, without any formal declaration. For consumers, the impact doesn't appear as a sudden shock, but as a slow-building pressure. Prices rise gradually but steadily. Choices become fewer, though more subtle. The purchasing power of the middle class doesn't collapse, it erodes. And when these changes last long enough, they morph into sentiment, a creeping sense that everything is getting more expensive and less predictable, even if on paper, the economy remains stable. This is exactly where soft power begins to feel the strain. Soft power isn't measured by commands, but by credibility. It lives in how partners perceive a market as a place to plan for the long term, or as one that always requires a contingency plan. When tariffs become a permanent political tool, that image begins to fray, even if it doesn't shatter all at once. To allies, the message received isn't a threat, but a quiet warning. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, even if that basket was once the safest. And once that warning is widely absorbed, it triggers a chain reaction. No one pulls away from the US out of hostility. They simply adjust to avoid absolute dependence. What's notable is that this entire process makes perfect sense from a business standpoint, and yet it carries a strategic cost at the national level. As capital and supply chains begin to disperse, America's leadership doesn't vanish, but it becomes diluted. Power isn't lost in a single moment. It thins over time, as those just-in-case decisions become the new norm. And while many economies are still struggling to adapt to this climate of uncertainty, Canada has seized this very moment. Not through confrontation, but through repositioning. Not with declarations, but with structure. From being seen merely as a reliable raw material supplier, Canada is beginning to take on a new role, that of a strategic node in the global value chain, where stability is not just an advantage, but a new form of leverage. Canada's shift didn't come through grand declarations or confrontational moves. It began with a very pragmatic question. How do you minimize risk in a world where stability can no longer be taken for granted? As the US market grew more unpredictable, Canada didn't respond emotionally, nor did it attempt to swap one dependency for another. Instead, it began to rebuild the way it positioned itself within the global value chain. For years, Canada had been comfortable in the role of a reliable supplier. Aluminum was mined, refined, and exported, feeding into larger industrial engines. It was a safe position, but also a vulnerable one, especially if downstream markets became politicized. That realization forced Canada to think beyond. If you're only a supplier, you're always at risk of being replaced or squeezed. But if you become an indispensable link, the power dynamic shifts. From this point, a repositioning strategy emerged. Canada started prioritizing long-term contracts, not just to sell volume, but to lock in demand. When demand is secured for years, even decades, businesses can justify investing in technology, in downstream capacity, and in higher value segments of the supply chain. Aluminum was no longer just a raw commodity. It became the foundation for products, standards, and supply chains in which Canada had a louder voice. In parallel came a subtle shift in how Canada was perceived. Partners no longer saw it simply as a convenient source, but as a stable anchor in a turbulent world. In a time when many nations are wrestling with policy risk, Canada's ability to maintain a consistent, predictable, and relatively apolitical trade profile became a strategic asset. Stability, once considered a given, was now being valued as a rare commodity. Crucially, Canada didn't seek to detach itself from the global system, but to embed itself deeper, on more favorable terms. As it joined new value chains, it no longer stood on the periphery, but gradually moved toward the center of long-term decision-making. Replacing Canada now isn't just costly in dollars, it's risky in terms of time, standards, and reliability. This repositioning also carries profound political meaning. It sends a quiet but unmistakable message to allies. In a shifting global order, power doesn't just come from scale or pressure, it comes from being the kind of pillar others can't afford to lose. Canada didn't need to publicly oppose tariffs to assert its standing. It let the structure of the supply chain speak for itself. Over time, this role as a strategic node gives Canada a new kind of power. Not the power to coerce, but the power to choose. As more players come to rely on the stability Canada offers, its negotiating strength naturally grows. And in a world where uncertainty is becoming the norm, that very stability becomes the most effective soft weapon of all. Looking back on the entire Canadian aluminum story, what lingers isn't the tariff rate, nor the trade graphs that rise and fall each quarter. What stays with us is a deeper truth about power in the 21st century. Power no longer lies in how quickly you can cause disruption, but in how long you can maintain stability. In a world where every supply chain is intertwined and every decision creates a ripple effect, stability is no longer the default state. It's a rare strategic asset. Tariffs, when wielded as political weapons, can create a short-term sense of control. They send a tough message, apply immediate pressure, and satisfy the political demand for swift action. But the economy doesn't operate on election cycles. Factories, mines, smelters, and logistics networks are built on timelines that span decades. When policy undermines those long-term assumptions, systems don't collapse overnight. They begin to self-correct in ways that are difficult to reverse. The aluminum story reveals a profound paradox. The attempt to assert power through force can unintentionally accelerate the very outcome it seeks to avoid: diversification and decoupling. When partners are compelled to prepare for a less dependent future, central power doesn't disappear in a flash. It erodes over time as risk management becomes the new default mode. The US remains a global powerhouse with unmatched strengths in technology, capital, and consumer markets. No aluminum dispute changes that. But in the era of global supply chains, leadership isn't defined by size alone. It's defined by trustworthiness. A market can be massive, but if it becomes predictable, it forces partners to keep a safe distance. And that distance, though small at first, multiplied across thousands of investment decisions, leads to strategic shifts. Canada, in this story, didn't win through confrontation. It didn't have to prove it was stronger, only that it was more stable. Its repositioning from a supplier to a strategic node wasn't a reactive move, but a long-term adaptation to a changing order. And that adaptation proves a vital point. New power doesn't always need to be loud. It can be quiet, steady, and enduring. Ultimately, the biggest lesson here isn't for the US or Canada alone. It's for every nation seeking to define its place in the 21st century. In a world full of volatility, the greatest leverage belongs to those who can provide stability, those who can earn and sustain trust. Not to coerce, but to be chosen. If you have your own perspective on this story, whether tariffs are a necessary tool or a long-term double-edged sword, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in deep geopolitical analysis exploring supply chains, economic power, and the quiet shifts reshaping our world, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next story.